you very much indeed, everybody who's here. I'm sure there'll be more people arriving, but we're not going to stop to wait for everybody. I think it's best to crack on. So I'm Katrina Davis. I'm a GP. I'm one of the directors of Greener Practice, and I'm delighted to see some of our previous directors of Greener Practice here, Mike and Artie. And Artie is going to be introducing Jake Robinson, who we are very privileged to have joining us from Australia as we speak to talk to us about microbes and climate. Now, just before he does that, I am just going to give a little bit of information about Greener Practice in case there are people joining us who don't know about Greener Practice, and that'll be about 7 minutes or so. And then Jake will start. I'll hand over to Artie, and then at the end of Jake's presentation, we will have a Q&A section. We will have a feedback form, and I'd be really grateful if people can complete that because it just helps us to know what we're doing right and what can be improved. And we'll aim to finish by 8:30. So I shall just share my screen. I'll unshare that part of my screen and go back to the bit that I actually wanted. There we go. Okay. Sorry, very unprofessionally, this won't let me. Right, are we there? Can you see that should say Greener Practice Platform Relevant Quips? Marvellous.
Yeah.
Okay, so if everybody can make sure they've got their mics off, that would be great. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a background about Greener Practice. So I'm one of the directors, and I just want to let people know that we are a community interest company, so we're a not-for-profit. We became a community interest company in 2021. And you can see there's a network map which shows where a lot was probably around about 900 people on that map at the moment, all across the UK. And this is people who've signed up on our website to become members for free of our network. We have a couple of other directors and ex-directors at the bottom there speaking at the RCGP conference and the highly commended asthma toolkit, which Artie was very instrumental in and which led to us being able to get some funding to do a new website. And the website was launched about 6 months ago, and it is designed to have quality improvement projects which can help people to become more sustainable in practice. The whole point is that sustainable healthcare is actually better care. It's not extra, and actually it can save, so it's better care, saves money, saves time, improves staff morale, it can improve retention of staff. And we know that because of the quality improvement projects being step by step and as easy as possible for clinicians to be able to use, they are really helpful for GP trainees and GP trainers. Also for appraisal processes, we've also got the CQC, as we've been in contact with the CQC to see how we can make sure that our quality improvement projects are aligned with what is expected of practices now for sustainability. And we also have ways of making sure that people can earn their points through some of these for the Green Impact for Health Toolkit for some of the quality improvement projects. So we've worked with a variety of people, quite a few people over the years, and that includes more recently University of Exeter, which has paid for their 5th-year students to access this so that they can use them on their GP and some of the hospital placements. And also London appraisers have a pilot going where they have paid so that they can improve the ability of appraisers to speak to their appraisees about how they can go about fulfilling sustainability as part of their daily life. So this is just to give an example really related to today's talk. And if you were to join the Network Plus, it's called, which is £30 for an individual and £20 if you're part of an organisation for a whole year to get access to all of this stuff. I'm not going to show you through the live website, but this is what you'd come to if you wanted to search. There are filters there for benefits, and so you can search by whether it boosts nature or whether it saves money and so forth. Also, whether or not there are any who it is that can do the quality improvement projects, and you can then decide whether you want to do them depending on how much time they take or whether they're how much carbon that they save. And then, for example, if you're going to, in this case, creating a GP practice garden, it tells you roughly how long it'll take, what the Green Impact for Health toolkit areas are that would be benefited, and which members of staff might be able to do it, also the CQC areas. And then it would also give you information about the benefits of the project for patients, practice and planet, plus a lot of the evidence, because these are evidence-based on what you would need, on the reason that this is going to improve the care of your patients, how to carry it out, and that is step by step how to carry it out, how to scale up or down, case study, and then you get a certificate. And if you are doing a project which we are able to calculate the financial and the carbon benefits, then that will be calculated on the certificate as well at the end. So lots of ways that you can benefit and practice patients and planet. This is an example of a fantastic little pocket garden that was created in Liverpool, and the way that that was done is on the case study for that particular quality improvement project. Just related to the talk today, there are all sorts of ways that we can potentially avoid using medication in the quality improvement projects. So as you can see, non-pharmaceutical prescribing for depression and anxiety, creating a practice garden I've mentioned, becoming an active practice, setting up a walking group, increasing referrals for social prescribing, boosting staff well-being, improving chronic pain management, de-prescribing reviews, lifestyle changes to improve cholesterol, improve prescribing. These are just a sample of all of the different things that we have available on the Network Plus. So these are the benefits you get if you join up as a member, which is free. You do it on the website using that QR code, and you can join as many or as few WhatsApp special interest groups as you like. We have one on nature, which is very active, education, so that's undergrad and postgrad education, special one for GP trainees, and also for clinical carbon and non-clinical carbon, clinical carbon being the biggest carbon footprint related to medication. And so discussions take place on there, as well as the ability to join one of the 30 local groups we've got across the country, and to receive newsletters and email updates. And to be able to get onto that map that I showed you at the beginning, you can show as much or as little about yourself as you want to be able to find other people who are doing similar to you nearby. And as I say, Network Plus membership, you'll then get over 50 quality improvement projects step by step, as I've demonstrated a few of them, plus over 120 resources, many of them bespoke, which can be adapted for your practice. And then if you join up as an organisation, depending on the size of your organisation, if you're a practice, it depends on your list size. So you'd get, say, for under 10,000, you'd get 5 users for £100. So essentially, it's £20 per user. Because we're not for profit, we're trying to keep the costs down as much as possible. We're pretty much all volunteers. So any way that we can encourage you to join us and to make this more of the norm, then that would be marvellous. So please have a look at our Instagram and LinkedIn. Do join those. And also, if you wanted to join for the webinars, newsletters, local groups, WhatsApp groups, and everything else, have a look at that QR code. That's me done. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, I'll hand back over now to Artie.
Rookie error there. I'll unmute myself. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Um, I am so utterly delighted, Jake, that you're joining us to talk about nature, microbiome, pandemics, um, the links between nature and well-being. And I just want to tell everyone here your links with us as an organisation. So, Jake, you were a PhD student back in 2017, 2018, when we were just starting up in Sheffield with the idea of how we can make, general practice act on the climate crisis. And at the time, we weren't even a community interest company. We were just a few people in Sheffield getting together and sort of linking with other people in Sheffield who were doing this sort of work. And I remember we had a talk from Professor Anna Jorgensen, who was your PhD supervisor, and she was doing amazing research at the time on urban green spaces and health inequality. And she came and gave us a talk, and she said, you know what, I'm going to ask Jake, my PhD student, he's absolutely incredible, to come and link in with you. And you were such an amazing positive force. You came in and you just got stuck in, and we're still really grateful for all the help you gave us with all the events, like even down to creating seed paper for us when we were trying to encourage people to think about all of this work. And you helped us with our logo. But most of all, for your incredible research and your incredible work. I think you are possibly one of the most amazing science communicators that I've ever come across. I remember sitting in the Jessop's Cafe and being absolutely mind blown by learning about the microbiome and how it influences our health, how really humans are not really how we understand ourselves, but that we're a conversation with our environment. So I'm really excited for you to do that for everyone here today, and actually change our worldview on health and well-being. So yeah, Jake, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us at an ungodly hour in the morning from Adelaide. And also, I should mention you are now a renowned author. You've published some incredible books: Invisible Friends, Tree Wilding, Nature of Pandemics, a book a year. I don't know how you do it. All the books are amazingly well researched, amazingly well communicated. You've been called the Henry David Thoreau of the microbiome by Richard Dawkins. So that's incredibly high praise. Take it away, Jake.
Thanks a lot, Artie. I really appreciate that. Pressure's on now. Um, yeah, firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge how proud I am of you guys. So from my early days as an awkward PhD student, joining some of your meetings, and then just seeing how you've developed this over the years and into what it is now. Yeah, super amazing. Well done. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen and get my presentation up. Okay, so I'm just going to be talking about how important it is that we protect nature from nature's sake, but also because it's important for human health. So the first part is going to be a bit slightly doom and gloomy, but hopefully interesting as well from an ecological perspective, talking about pandemics and outbreaks. And then I'm going to be talking about how amazing microbes are, as most of them actually play key roles in keeping us alive and healthy. Okay, so let's get into it. So who am I? So I'm a microbial and restoration ecologist. So the first part means I study microorganisms in the environment, so bacteria, fungi, viruses, etc., and how they shape human health, but in beneficial ways rather than disease-causing ways, even though the first part is about pandemics and such. And then the second part means that I just develop ways to restore damaged and degraded ecosystems. I studied lots of different things. That is to say that my work is very interdisciplinary. That will probably come out in this talk as well. And I'm currently based at Flinders University, which is a little dot there in South Australia. And you can find more out about my work at some of these links. Oh yeah, and I'm actually going to be launching a new research facility soon around One Health, and it's going to be kind of part research lab and part creative studio. So I think we need to combine creative thinking with science in order to generate some better solutions for the world. So watch this space for that. Okay, let's get into it. So just whiz through some of the kind of key outbreaks and pandemics, etc., that have affected people over the years. So we didn't really have them until a couple of thousand years ago, and that's mostly because, you know, these sorts of things are what we call crowd infections, as a lot of you probably know. We simply just didn't live in crowds until a couple of thousands of years ago. So, you know, 5,000-10,000 years ago, the idea of when will the next pandemic happen simply wouldn't have entered the human brain. So, you know, there's been some huge pandemics and outbreaks over the years. The bubonic plague is responsible for 200 million deaths. Smallpox as well was really impactful. And there's this one called Cocalitzli as well. This happened in Mexico, and this was essentially where Europeans went over to Central and South America and took over some diseases with them, and this killed 17 million indigenous peoples, unfortunately. And recent research suggests that this might have been salmonella, so I found that quite strange, actually, but interesting, isn't it? And so over the last 100 years or so, we had more flu-like outbreaks and pandemics happen for various reasons, and some of these reasons are attributed to human activities. And then we've obviously lived through the COVID-19 pandemic. 7.1 million people potentially died, potentially up to 15 million in the first few years, but probably underreported. So that was obviously a really harrowing time. And then there's this one on the end called Disease X. Now, this is a World Health Organization placeholder term for what the next pandemic, we know there's going to be a disease coming that's going to probably have similar effects to the COVID-19 pandemic. We just don't know what it is or where exactly it's going to come from. So they give it this kind of placeholder term called Disease X. So 6 years ago or so, COVID-19 would have been known as Disease X. Now, importantly, zoonotic diseases, so these are diseases that jump from animals, so it can be wild or domestic animals, into humans. The outbreaks are increasing in frequency and diversity. So this is something we should be really concerned about and talking about more. And they're increasing in frequency and diversity for a variety of reasons. And again, many of them are human driven. So I'm just going to whiz through some of these now. So we have the illegal wildlife trade. That's kind of self-explanatory. You know, wild animals should be in the wild, not in people's houses and people cooking them up in hot pots, etc. They should be out in the wild. So this brings us into closer contact with various disease vectors. And then we have habitat destruction. And this works on from a few different directions. So firstly, kind of chopping down habitats brings us into closer contact again with disease vectors, meaning it's more likely that a spillover event's going to happen. But it also stresses animals out. So certain wild animals that do carry pathogens that are important for humans, when we reduce their resources, as I'll talk about in a moment, this causes extreme stress on those animals, and it weakens their immune system, more likely that viruses are going to replicate and shed into the environment, and then increase the chance again of a spillover event. Then we have climate change. So climate change is affecting the distribution at which certain pathogens and vectors can survive. So it's changing the distribution across the world. And then we have agriculture intensification. So, we're cramming animals into closed, confined spaces. And this creates the kind of ideal conditions. It's like a hotbed for pathogen evolution and jumping from one animal or even one species to another. And then we have chemical pollution. And this is a form of ecosystem degradation that's actually shaping disease dynamics. And I'll talk about a kind of chemical pollution example in a moment. And then we have urbanization and globalization. So we ourselves are now the kind of mega vector of diseases. We're traveling across the world. We're living in more densely urbanized environments. And so we are transmitting lots of diseases. So there's all sorts of reasons why zoonotic diseases are increasing in frequency and diversity, or outbreaks. So I'm just going to talk about some principles now, some examples. So the first one is relating to a particular species. So this shows you an example of why even protecting one particular species is so important from an intrinsic value, but also from a disease prevention perspective. So this story goes that in the 1980s, back in India, there were 40 million vultures, soaring across the skies. These are one of my favorite animals, one of my favorite birds of prey. So they play a really important role in the ecosystem. So they clean up carcasses. So when animals die, vultures move in and consume them. And their gastrointestinal system provides a kind of dead end for certain pathogens as well. So not only do they kind of clean up dead bodies, they can prevent diseases from spreading around. So there were 40 million vultures in the 1980s in India, but by the mid-1990s, the species had declined by 95%. So one of the fastest declines of any vertebrate species in the world, just in 15, 20 years. And the reason for their decline was that farmers in India were using diclofenac. So you probably all know what that is. It's an anti-inflammatory that humans even take. But farmers were giving diclofenac to their cows to prevent lameness and to prolong their life. But diclofenac just so happens to be extremely toxic to vultures. So in tiny quantities can essentially kill a vulture. And so the cows were kind of dying naturally after they'd been inoculated with diclofenac. After a while, they were dying. The vultures were consuming the cows. Obviously, the diclofenac had transmitted to the vulture, and the vultures were simply dying. It's a bit of a sad story, but I interviewed a conservationist from India, and he was quite jovial about some of the stories he was telling me. He says, the villagers were wondering why, there were no vultures around. They're simply just disappearing. And he said, what reason do you think it is? And the number one reason they gave was the Americans were vacuuming them out of the sky. And then he was laughing his head off as he was telling me. Anyway, so it was kind of an interesting conversation, but obviously it has a really important implication. So he was actually doing treetop surveys, and then he found that the vultures were actually consuming the diclofenac and then returning to their treetops and simply dying in the treetops. So that was why nobody saw them when they died. Importantly, this links to disease dynamics in a very important way. So 95% decline in the vulture species. This actually led to a boom in feral dog populations because the dogs were kind of seeing all the carcasses around and saying, oh, there's lots of dog food for us. And they were consuming the cows instead. And then so the feral dog population boomed. This brought them into close contact with humans in urban areas and even rural areas, I guess. And then this led to an increase in dog bites between the dogs and humans. And then this led to a rabies outbreak. So thousands of people died, and it cost the Indian economy billions of dollars. So this is just illustrating, how we put a certain chemical in an environment and it's essentially wiped out just one species, and then how this can have some profound effects, cascading effects, leading to very deadly diseases in humans. So I just wanted to point that out. That it's important that we protect biodiversity, even individual species. There's this idea in a disease ecology called the dilution effect as well. So this relates a bit more to the habitat destruction example that I gave. And in this dilution effect, there's also a concept called host competency, and this refers to an animal, its kind of ability to host a particular pathogen. So if an animal is highly competent, it means that its immune system is very welcoming to a particular pathogen. Its body provides it a nice safe haven. So if an animal is incompetent, if you like, then its immune system kind of boots out these pathogens. It doesn't provide a very welcoming environment. Now, importantly, when we have a thriving ecosystem, so when an ecosystem is intact, there's often a higher species diversity and often a lower relative abundance of highly competent hosts. Okay, so if you look at the screen now, you'll see, for example, in a thriving ecosystem, we might only have this one mouse here that's a highly competent host that supports pathogens of a particular kind. Whereas when we degrade ecosystems and when we destroy habitats, etc., we actually reduce the species diversity in many cases, and this can result in a higher relative abundance of highly competent hosts. So as you can see in this bottom example, we might have the same number of species, same number of animals, sorry, but the relative abundance of highly competent hosts increases in a degraded ecosystem. Now, in a thriving ecosystem where it's intact and flourishing, we might have these ticks, these ectoparasites, ixodid ticks, and they're the ones that transmit Borrelia burgdorferi. It's a bacterium that causes Lyme disease in humans. So you might have 5 ticks, say, but only one of those 5 ticks actually has the Borrelia burgdorferi bacterium. And that's because there's a dilution effect in a thriving ecosystem. And then this leads to a lowish infection risk in humans. Whereas when we're degrading ecosystems, the relative abundance of highly competent hosts increase, then we might have the same number of ticks in that ecosystem, but actually 4 out of 5 of those ticks carry the Borrelia burgdorferi bacterium, because that dilution effect isn't at play. And then this can lead to a much higher infection risk in humans. So again, this just illustrates why it's important. I think we should be protecting biodiversity for its intrinsic value, but it also has instrumental value, particularly from a human health perspective. So we need to protect ecosystems, and this just provides a good example of why from a disease perspective. And then my final example before I move on to how amazing microbes are is I'm going to talk about bats. So this fella here is a grey-headed flying fox in Adelaide. So it's a photo I took in the Adelaide Parklands, or the Botanic Gardens. Now, the grey-headed flying foxes, they can carry various deadly viruses that can affect humans, and there have been a few spillover events in Australia. Now, if you look at this figure on the right here, if you look at the top panel, then this just explains that in a kind of stable, thriving ecosystem, there is more than enough energy for these bats to survive and thrive and be healthy. Okay, so the blue band represents the energy required for those bats to be healthy, and the energy comes from fruiting trees or flowering trees. Now, in a thriving ecosystem, there's also a buffer, so there's more than enough energy required for these bats to be healthy, and that's what's represented by this blue band on the top. But if you move down to B and then to C, you can see that human activities with degrading ecosystems, wiping out certain habitats that are really important for these bats. We're reducing the energy available to these bats, and then when you get to C, you can see that the total energy needed exceeds the total energy available in that ecosystem, to the point where we get to a point where it's called allostatic overload. So the bats are really desperate, they're searching for food, but they can't find any because we chopped all the trees down. And so this causes extreme stress in the bats. And this is a bit text heavy, so apologies for that. But protecting bat habitat is imperative, because when their habitat is under threat, they are more likely to come into contact with humans as they search for better places to feed and live. And so the bats in Adelaide, they're not locally native. They've moved over from Queensland because we've chopped down their fruiting trees, and they found ornamental trees around Adelaide that support their needs. But when their habitat is under threat, they are also more likely to be stressed. And this is a point I made earlier. And so stress alters the balance between the host and the virus. This imbalance can lead to an increase in viral replication and shedding, the process by which viruses are released from an infected host and into the environment, allowing the virus to spread to others. Okay, so this again illustrates the importance of protecting biodiversity from an intrinsic perspective, but also from an instrumental perspective. And this is a really nice illustration of the One Health concept. So this is the idea that human health, animal health, obviously we're animals as well, and we should probably be viewing ourselves more in the sense that we are just another ape in the ecosystem, because then we can start to view health as an ecological concept, which I personally think is important. But human health, non-human animal health, so wild animals and domestic animals, and generally the health of the environment are deeply interconnected. Okay, so if you kind of affect one end of this triad, then the whole thing crumbles. So we need to be looking after each other from a multi-species perspective, not just ourselves, but also our fellow biotic community members. And this is a paper I published a few years ago. It's kind of framing ecosystem restoration as a public health intervention, and the idea that restoration, so restoring damaged and degraded ecosystems, restoring nature, is integral to humanity's recovery from COVID-19. I'm not sure we've learned our lessons though. And then this is just a figure from that paper just describing some of those concepts. The panel C is actually referring to social prescribing and green prescribing. So the idea that we can prescribe people to spend time, meaningful time in nature in order to improve their health and well-being. Okay, so that's the kind of doom and gloomy stuff out of the way, but I hope you've found some of it interesting from a disease ecology perspective. So now I'm going to be talking about how amazing microbes are for our health as well, because, you know, there's enough disease narrative out there. We need to kind of reframe some of it at least to have a more holistic perspective of our health. But firstly, just to acknowledge that there are several pathways. So this is from a paper from 3 years ago. The arrows have gone out of line for some reason, sorry. There are several pathways linking biodiversity with human health. So 6 pathways here, and 5 of them are kind of good, I suppose. But then there's also the harm-causing pathway that we should consider as well. So we have biological pathways, and I'll talk more about that one in a moment in terms of interacting with environmental microbes. The psychological pathway, for example, there's various theories out there. There's one called attention restoration theory, so restoring your attention. There's all sorts of stress regulation theories, etc. The social pathway, so spending time in green spaces and blue spaces, so, you know, parks and woodlands or rivers and, you know, oceans or whatever, is really conducive to convivial gatherings as well. So lots of people gather in these areas, and it really does boost that social element. Physical activity, so it's supportive of exercise. So, you know, green spaces are very conducive to exercising, particularly in Australia. I've noticed it's a very, you know, sort of exercise outdoors kind of place. And then environmental buffering, if you see in the bottom right corner. So, you know, you might have heard of ecosystem services. So basically biodiversity provides these so-called gifts or these ecosystem services to us. And one of them, example on here, is reducing the urban heat island effect. So this is where urban environments with their various, you know, grey surfaces retain a lot of the heat from the sun. And this can actually have an important effect on people's health. So, you know, providing lots of trees and vegetation in our urban areas reduces the negative effects of that urban heat island effect. And then, as I mentioned, there's a harm-causing pathway as well, which we should consider as well. So there are disease vectors out in nature, as we've mentioned in the first half of this talk, and particularly in some countries, there are predators that we should probably be at least thinking about. And so I'm mostly going to be covering the biological pathway for the rest of this talk, but happy to talk about the other pathways another time. Okay, so I like to use this phrase, all the nature we can see intimately depends upon all the nature we can't see. I'll just let that sink in for a second. And so what I mean by that is that you can marvel at my beautiful artwork here. When we're out in nature, we see, you know, all the visible things that we see. So we might see plants or tree, we might see an animal, and we might see soils. But if you just imagine that you had these kind of space age microscope goggles that you could put on, so you could see the invisible world. Well, if you had these goggles on, you would probably see something a bit more like this. So microorganisms, they're absolutely everywhere. They're omnipresent, all over plants, inside animals, all over animals, in the soil, in the air, etc. So actually one of the least accurate parts is this big empty space in the middle, and that's the air. And so, you know, in the what we call the aerobiome, so this is the microbial communities in the air, there's actually millions of them all over. Every time you breathe in, you're breathing in millions of microbes. So actually a more representative version would be something like this. So microbes are everywhere, okay? We just can't see them. Now, I want to ask you all who considers themselves to be independent. I can't see you, so I'll just trust that everybody's putting their hand up. Well, humans are literally incapable of doing anything by themselves. Okay, so we all depend on these microbial communities that live on our bodies. So we have millions of microbes, bacteria, fungi, viruses, etc., living on our skin, in our airways, and particularly in our gut. Now, these microbes carry functional genes, so important parts of their DNA that encode for various proteins that allow our body to function in a healthy way. So a lot of our health and good health, we have microbes to thank for. So we can view ourselves as this kind of meat vehicle. So we are the visible organs, part of the human body, plus the invisible microbiome, which equates to a complete human. So this is what we call a holobiont. So in fact, we all depend on the 100 trillion microbes that currently reside inside and on our bodies at any given moment. And this actually refers to bacteria. So everybody watching this video right now, this call right now, has around 380 trillion viruses inside them at any given moment. So absolutely mind-blowing numbers. But many of these viruses, we call them bacteriophages, they're actually playing important roles in keeping various bacteria in check. So the same kind of predator-prey dynamics that occur in the visible world, you can think of a lion hunting down an antelope. These same kind of dynamics occur, but in the invisible world and inside your body. So we have all these different kinds of microbes. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. We have bacteria, archaea, viruses, fungi. So most people think of fungi as the big mushrooms that you consume on your dinner. But actually many, if not most, are invisible or near invisible. And then we have protozoa and microalgae and various others as well. Now, let's just go through a couple of them. So the top one in the middle is a bacteriophage. So this is that virus that kind of lands on a bacterium's membrane, and then it sort of it drills down a hole into the membrane and inoculates its genetic material into the bacterium so it can proliferate. These look kind of like spiders, don't they? They're like space landers that hunt down bacteria. Then the one in the middle is called a geobacter bacterium. This lives deep down in the mud, in the soil, so you don't have these living inside you. And this lives in anaerobic conditions, so where there's no oxygen. And these can generate their own electricity through these protein nanowires that come off its body. And then the top right, you may have recognized, this is called a tardigrade, or a moss piglet, or a water bear, and some people find them cute. You probably don't have these living on your body either. If you do, you probably want to go see yourself, go see a doctor. But these actually live in mosses and lichens, etc. So we have all these different kinds of microbes, all different shapes and sizes, and many of these will be living in your body. So a few snappy statistics on the microbiome. So the genes in your microbiome outnumber your own genes by 150 to 1. There are 1.3 times more microbes than human cells in your body. So you're essentially more microbes than human. And if you could extract the microbes from just one person's body and line them up in a row, they'd be able to circle the Earth 2.5 times. So again, just mind-blowing numbers. And so we have lots of different kinds of microbes. They all play different important functions. And then this is just a quirky note on the size differences. So I think we kind of standardize the size of microorganisms. We think, yeah, they're very tiny. They'll almost be probably similar size. But this represents a virus, and this guy represents a bacterium. And actually, the largest bacterium is 37,500 times bigger than the smallest virus. And you might be thinking, okay, that sounds like quite a lot, but let's just put that into perspective. So that's exactly the same as comparing a single poppy seed, so a little speck on this muffin here, with a blue whale. So absolutely huge size differences in this invisible world all around us and inside us. And a blue whale is all of these animals combined. Okay, so enough of the kind of snappy statistics now. So I'm just going to be talking a little bit about immunology. So Tari Hatela, who's an immunologist from Finland, says we are protected by 2 nested layers of biodiversity. The microbes of the outer layer, so in the soil, the water, the plants and the animals, and the microbes of the inner layer, so the human gut, the skin and the airways. And importantly, our bodies are colonized by microbes from the outer layer. So as I mentioned before, you can view yourself as this kind of walking ecosystem. You are a host plus trillions of microbial species working symbiotically to form a functioning ecological unit. So one thing you should take away from this talk is no longer to view individual humans as individuals. You are essentially a community of life, constantly interacting with your environment, constantly falling apart at the microscopic level, but constantly rebuilding yourself. So everyone watching this has their own kind of signature microbial cloud following them around that's different to everybody else's. And you're all emitting 1 million biological particles from your body every single hour. So we should treat our body as essentially as a community. So that's the most important point. And this has very important health implications. Again, this is why I think we should be moving into the realms of viewing health as an ecological concept. We are just another species in the ecosystem, and we have lots of species living inside us that play important roles in keeping us healthy. Therefore, health is ecological in one sense. So a famous immunologist from London, who's a friend of mine, Professor Graham Rook, he likens the human immune system at birth to a computer system. So he says, at birth, we have the hardware in place, and this is analogous to the cellular structures of our immune system. He says, at birth, we also have the software in place, and this is analogous to the genes that encode for various proteins that allow our immune system to function. But he says, well, the one thing we lack at birth, our immune system lacks, is data. And much like a computer requires data in order to work, train the models, etc., so does our immune system. And this is important because the data is actually microorganisms. So he's referring to microbes, lots of different kinds of species of microbes from the outer layer, from the environment. So he says this is important for three reasons why it's important to be exposed to lots of different species of microorganisms from a very young age. One is because of our adaptive immune system. So we're exposed to lots of different species that allows us to build up this kind of tiny repertoire of memory immune cells. And we also create this kind of cookbook or recipe book for how to deal with some of these microbes. So the next time we come into contact with pathogens, we're able to mount a much more efficient immune response. So that's one reason. The second reason is what's called the innate immune system. I know you know a lot about this. So the innate immunity is also referred to as non-specific immunity. So in the absence of appropriate regulation, the innate immune system will basically attack absolutely anything that tries to invade the body. And this includes ordinarily innocuous things like dust and pollen and animal hair, and even the human's own cells. And so this is what manifests as an autoimmune disorder. So without proper regulation, all these bad things can happen. And Graham Rook puts forward this idea of old friends microorganisms that provide that regulation. It works through this idea called pattern recognition receptors. So we've co-evolved with certain species of microbes in the environment over thousands of years, and they've played a key role in shaping our innate immune system, and they play that regulatory role. So they provide a kind of low level but continuous stimulation, which trains the immune system not to overreact when it comes into contact with certain things, like pollen and dust, for instance. But we've kind of been shutting nature out of our lives, and we're reducing exposure to these important co-evolved relationships. The third reason it's important to have a diverse microbiome in and on your body, so on your skin, in your gut, is what we call in ecology the competitive exclusion principle. So this is the idea that having a well-established ecosystem in your body, where the microorganisms kind of get along, they've been working together for a while, they're more likely to band together and boot out opportunistic pathogens that try and invade the body. So there's this kind of no room at the inn effect going on. Let me scan forward. So we have adaptive immunity, these tiny armies of memory immune cells, innate immunity, so providing the regulatory role from these old friends microbes, and competitive exclusion, this kind of no room at the inn. But actually it's more like a no room at the dining table. So this recent study showed that microbiome diversity protects against pathogens by nutrient blocking. So actually, as this image describes here, having a higher microbial diversity in general, sorry, my screen's gone weird. Where's it gone? Back in a moment. There we go. Having a higher microbiome diversity in your body equates to a higher colonization resistance. So essentially, again, these well-established microbes that live in your body that have been colonized from the environment, they band together and essentially consume the nutrients that would otherwise be available for opportunistic pathogens. And so we need that diversity from the environment, but also from our food. Obviously, having lots of diverse, colourful foods is really important to feed those microbes inside you. So we're constantly falling apart, constantly rebuilding ourselves, and constantly interacting with our environments. And this is a key reason why the quality of our environment, our living environment, is a key determinant of our health. So we have this biodiversity or old friends hypothesis, the idea that we've moved away from our more ancestral environments where there's more biodiversity around us. We're more exposed to those old friends microorganisms, less exposed, sorry, to those organisms, because we've shut nature out of our lives. We're living in more highly urbanized environments. And then this just illustrates the idea of this old friends hypothesis. So we're essentially seeing two global megatrends at the moment. One is a huge decline in biodiversity at the hand of humans, largely, and also this rise in immune disorders. And we think they're both linked. So this decline in biodiversity leads to a microbial deprivation in the human body, a microbial imbalance and a disturbed immune response, which leads to a higher risk of inflammatory diseases. So how do we know that biodiversity loss affects the human microbiome? Well, there's lots of different kinds of studies out there now at various different levels and various formats. And one of them we can look at is a population level study. So there's some cool ones coming out of Finland. So they're looking at the people there called the Finnish Karelia people versus the Russian Karelia people. And there's also this cool one in America, so comparing the Amish and the Hutterites, and it has a similar kind of design. Now, the Amish and Hutterites are very similar genetically, very similar to where they come from. Various other lifestyle factors are very similar. The one thing that differs, the key thing that differs, is their farming practices. Now, the Amish still practice quite hands-on traditional farming practices. They're more in contact with the soils, the microbes in the soils, the animals, the plants, etc. And the Hutterites have moved towards more modernized, chemical, mechanized based farming practices, and they're less exposed to the biodiversity around them, especially the soils and the microbes. And what we see is key differences in inflammatory diseases and things like asthma. So there's a much higher prevalence of these diseases in the Hutterite population than the Amish. And researchers have linked this to the microbiome. So they've looked at the Amish house dust and the fecal microbiome. So house dust is just a good indicator of what microbes live in your local environment. So microbes, they float through the windows and doors into your house. Animals bring them in, your pets. You bring them in yourself on your clothes, etc. And so they all settle in the house dust in your house. And then we can actually look at the DNA in this dust of these microbes and sequence the DNA, and it gives us a good indication of who at the microscopic level is living in your local environment. And then the fecal microbiome is obviously a decent indicator of the microbiome in the gut. And so they've inoculated these into germ-free mice, so mice that have been born without microbes, so that you know that what you do to the mouse is probably coming from the effect is probably coming from the thing that you do rather than their inherent microbiome. And so they found that the Amish house dust microbiome and fecal microbiome is protective from immune disorders, and the Hutterites microbiome is implicated in the onset of immune disorders. And so that's just another kind of study that people are doing. There's various other ones that are similar. And then there's this biodiversity intervention study. So this is the idea that, we can intervene, even though we're shutting nature out of our lives and our environments are quite desolate, we can actually intervene with important health implications. So this is in Finland, and they essentially identified a load of daycare centres, children's daycare centres that didn't have much nature in them, and then they kept 50% of them quite desolate, so not much nature. The other 50%, which was the intervention group, they brought in local forest floor materials, so things like soils and sod and grasses and various plants. And then they allowed children to play as they would normally over 27 days. And what they found is that the intervention group increased the diversity significantly of the microbiome in the skin and the gut of these children. They also took immune markers from blood and saliva and found that a more appropriate immune response was happening as well. And so this is just showing, this is over 27 days, and it also lasted a year later. So they did a longitudinal follow-up study, and which had similar important effects. And it also had this dual effect. So it increased the diversity of microbes, which is generally considered a good thing. And there are some caveats which I can talk about. But it also reduced the relative abundance of certain opportunistic pathogens as well in the children. And this is probably due to that competitive exclusion principle that I mentioned earlier. So pretty cool stuff going on. it shows that we can intervene. These are just a few slides, a few figures from my PhD a few years ago. So we showed that, we can design urban environments as well by bringing in more different kinds of plants, and that can actually increase the diversity of the microbes that we're exposed to in the air. Again, generally considered a better thing for our health. So having more diverse kind of plant species around, and this probably applies in your house as well, provides a more diverse assemblage of microbes in the environment that we're exposed to. And then certain plants can also reduce the relative abundance of certain pathogens as well. And then this just illustrates, this is what I call vertical stratification. So the microbes in the air that we're exposed to largely come from the soil beneath our feet. So the soil is the most biodiverse habitat on the planet. Up to 99% of all species on the planet Earth live in soils, and they actually feed the aerobiome. So they're constantly feeding the air that we're exposed to with these microbes. And many of them are potentially important for our health in beneficial ways. And this just shows us vertical stratification in the air column. So the lower you are down, closer you are to the soil, the higher the diversity of microbes, which kind of makes sense. So actually, taking kids out into green spaces and forests, etc., they're probably more likely to be exposed to a higher diversity of microbes, particularly around their facial regions, than taller adults. Okay, so this is a quick note on phytoncides. So I talked about microbes. Well, phytoncides are these organic compounds that various plants emit, and phytoncides have evolved actually to as a kind of antimicrobial mechanism. So sometimes when we bring plants in and it reduces certain pathogens in the air, this might be as a result of these chemicals that they're pumping out. But various phytoncides, they're also known as essential oils. It's a bit of a fancy way of saying it. They've been shown to be beneficial for human health and well-being in various ways. So plant-derived organic compounds that come from things like, an example might be lavender, another example is pine forests. So when we go forest bathing, for instance, we're literally bathing in these organic compounds in addition to microorganisms. So there's been studies that show they promote proper immune function and enhance natural killer cell activity, and then this can result in certain enzymes like granzymes and perforin. So perforin is named perforin because it can literally kind of perforate holes in tumor cells actually. And there's studies showing it can reduce inflammation in the body and lower stress hormones. There's links to reduced blood pressure, particularly in the forest bathing literature. Increased positive affect, so this is positive emotion. And these are all in human studies. And then the last one's actually in an animal study, a non-human animal study. They may improve sleep as well via interacting with gamma-aminobutyric acid in the body, this neurotransmitter or this system that's responsible in part for regulating excitation in the brain. So it has an important role in our ability to sleep. So not only are we exposed to microbes in the environment, we're also exposed to all these chemicals that are emitted by plants. So we're kind of forest bathing in these chemicals and microbes when we go for a walk in a forest. This is to say that when we spend time in nature, it should be a truly multi-sensory experience if we're trying to acquire the greatest health benefits. So we can engage all of the senses when we're out in nature. Even the taste sense, you can go foraging, but in particular sight, smell, touch, and sound. And there are various biochemical pathways in terms of how this influences human health. Simply looking at something that's pleasing in nature, like fractal patterns. So these kind of self-repeating patterns in nature. You can see them in trees and plants. Go back. And beautiful flowers and diverse colours, etc. When we're in nature, simply looking at this can interact with the visual cortex in the brain, and then different parts of the brain talk to each other, and then eventually this leads to a chemical called acetylcholine being released from the vagus nerve, and then this can hook onto receptors in the heart called M2 receptors. You probably know all this, and then it can slightly lower the heart rate. So all this happens simply by looking at something in nature. And there are similar pathways for sight, hearing, sound, etc. as well. So it should be a truly multi-sensory experience. And I've mentioned that being colonized by microbes from the environment is probably important, but I'm really interested in the indirect effects on the gut microbiome of spending time in nature through stress regulatory pathways. So through the HPA axis, for instance. So we know that stress regulation and how we handle stressful events can actually physically shape the gut environment. Therefore, it can shape the composition of the microbes that live in your gut. So simply, handling stress in a slightly different way can actually shape your gut microbiome. It's kind of mind-blowing, really. And that doesn't involve any colonization by food or your environments. So simply spending time in nature could shape your gut microbiome indirectly. So I'm hoping to do more research in that space soon. So when it comes to kind of, green prescribing or asking your patients to go out into nature for health benefit reasons, there are different kinds of environments, aren't they? So it's not this kind of one size fits all affair. You can't just say, go and spend time in nature, it'll be good for you. For instance, there are woodlands. Some people might find a woodland environment actually quite intimidating. So it's not as simple as like saying, go and spend some time in a woodland. So they might be more interested in spending time in an urban park where there's more people around. Some people might not like that. Some people might not even like walking, so gardening might be better for them. And there are various therapeutic horticultural groups around where you can actually socialize whilst you're gardening as well. But then some people might not like socializing or might not be in the emotional state to socialize, and that's okay. So some of these groups you can actually just turn up and just contribute to gardening, and it can still have an important effect on your well-being. Some people might be more sporty, so there are more physical activities that you can do. So it's not really a one-size-fits-all affair. So really, when you're talking about green prescribing and sending people out into nature, you've kind of got to understand your patient and match the activity to the patient rather than kind of aiming for this ideal exposure. Having said that, there are studies that show 2 hours a week is probably a really good time to aim for, a duration in nature. But again, it's not just necessarily about time spent in nature, it's that kind of meaningful engagement. And there are various strategies you can use to help people engage through those multiple senses in a meaningful way. And this can be done in 2-hour slots, or it can be 20 odd minutes a day, for instance. There's evidence to show that if you do write it down like a proper prescription, then people are more likely to stick at this kind of this process, which is probably quite important from your perspective. It makes it a bit more systematic and a bit more official, which is quite interesting, isn't it, really? But yeah, it's important. Again, I've mentioned, you should adapt to your prescription to things like access or mobility, the safety concerns, people's emotional states, their cultures and their interests is really important. In order for them to A, want to do it, B, be able to access it, and C, to stick at it. So if they're not interested or if they feel unsafe, they're not going to stick at it in the long term. So you kind of got to understand your patient a little bit more rather than saying just spend time in nature. And there are systematic ways of doing that. I've mentioned the multi-sensory benefits as well. So there are strategies to help people engage with nature. How are we doing for time?
We've got a minute, Jake.
Oh, crikey. Okay. Yeah, I'll just wrap up. So, and then there's this idea of nature connectedness. So this experiential, cognitive, and this kind of connection with nature. I can talk about this another time, but essentially nature connectedness is a psychological instrument that's been validated, and it's been shown to improve mental well-being, greater vitality, more satisfaction with life, and a greater meaning and purpose in life. And again, you can give people real practical activities in order to help them engage with nature. And yeah, happy to talk about this another time. Sorry, I've gone over by quite a bit. But yeah, feel free to email me and we can talk about strategies. Thanks. Happy to answer questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jake. I mean, there's so much to this, and I think we may well have to have you back to talk about so many of the other things. I know that since I learned about some of the evidence that you presented today several years ago, it's completely changed my practice. So now I don't just talk about physical activity, I talk about spending time in nature, and I actually do talk about phytokines or phytosides, I think you've called it today.
Phytosides, yeah.
Yeah, phytosides, yeah. And I talk about how plants emit these chemicals that boost our natural immune systems, and I know when I go for a walk in the forest now, I actually think about the microbes that I'm breathing into my lungs, and when I'm gardening, I think about the wonderful microbe friends that are helping my health. So yeah, it has absolutely changed my practice, and it's interesting to me that often patients do also really respond to the idea of some, like you say, we have to adapt it to our patients, but some form of nature, just instead of just being told physical activity, which they often just think means going to the gym. And I'm like, no, go out to the park, go out into nature. So thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating. I'm sure everybody else has found it just as enjoyable and as fascinating. Now, obviously, it is 8:30, so if people have to get off, then please do. But if anyone would like to stay and ask questions, please do as well. Tree has put in the chat there's a feedback form that we'd be quite...
I think Emily was going to add the link. There we go. Brilliant. So if people could help themselves to literally 30 seconds of time now to complete the feedback link, we'd be very, very grateful. In the meantime, while you're doing that, I do have a question for Jake. That was just fascinating, Jake. Very briefly, is there anywhere successfully that is educating populations and reducing the amount of chemicals sold to the public for the garden and home? Because it feels very frustrating when we're trying in our own little patches of nature to garden for wildlife and so forth, and then your next door neighbour puts a load of Roundup or whatever it might be, and you know that the birds that are coming to your garden are going to be feeding on whatever it is that is already fed on something that's feeding on. Right? Is there anywhere that's successfully doing this? Because it seems bonkers that the NHS is having to pick up the pieces from the worsening health as a result.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, so there are various studies now that show things like glyphosate, etc., do affect the microbiome in the environment as well. I don't actually know anyone anywhere that's actually doing this in a systematic way at the population level. I mean, Australia's pretty bad for it. Like, everyone uses these quite harsh chemicals on their lawns, etc. But it's definitely needed for sure. And there's this idea of telling kids to go out and play in dirt and eat the soil, etc., which might have been important in the past. But obviously we've polluted our soils and our environment so much now that telling them to kind of go and eat dirt is there's various caveats to that now, that it can contain cadmium and lead, etc., and various, as you say, synthetic chemicals. So yeah, I don't think anyone is really doing it very effectively. I wish they were. And we're developing this idea called dirty play, where we are telling kids, we are developing strategies for children to be able to play in the soils, for instance. But we're providing soil tests as well, so they can actually test for chemicals in the soil to make sure there's no kind of really nasty things in the soil before kids do go and play out there. But I mean, we definitely need a cultural change in general in terms of protecting our ecosystems, including our gardens as well. And I agree that we shouldn't be using Roundup, etc. It's just completely unnecessary. Yeah,
it seems bonkers that it's sold and it's in plastic and it's been transported and all the rest of it. Anyway,
don't get me started.
We've got Joe's asking a question there as well. So whether or not you've got some resources or whether anybody else can share any that are related to this. Joe, do you want to speak up and ask if there's anything specific you're after?
No, I just thought thanks, Joe. It was really good. I think sometimes afterwards you sort of you remember a few little bits and then you're like, oh, what was that statistic or what was that thing? So just something we could potentially go back to or to help us share with patients as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can provide like a list of resources, so papers and websites and things. But I'm also keen to work with people. I'm also keen to collaborate with anyone. If you think that there can be like a mini project in terms of providing some sort of useful resource that would be helpful to GPs and other practitioners, happy to collaborate is what I'm saying. I want to have a positive impact on the world. So if that's going to help, then please get in touch.
I'm sure that would be brilliant for greener practice, to be honest. If you could provide anything like that, that would be amazing. Because it's exactly what Joe's after is what, are there any information leaflets that we can, in our 10-minute slot, be able to impart to people to go away and read, send it on a text message or something, which is concise, friendly, reading age of 9, you know, all the stuff that we need for that public information.
Sure. I mean, I can produce a resource if there isn't one that's particularly useful. I know I did a talk on this dirty play concept a few weeks ago for Play. There's an organization called International Play Association. And yeah, so every time someone gives a talk there, they normally ask them to put forward this kind of quick fact sheet for them. So I could do something similar for you guys if that's helpful.
That'll be brilliant. Thank you. It looks like Mike's got a question.
Which is,
Hi, Mike.
Can you share a bit of your thoughts on diet and its impact on the gut microbiome? We get lots from Zoe, but as Zoe has become more and more financially rewarding for its founders, it might have got
Zoe,
slightly less trustworthy.
Maybe. I mean, diet is super important for maintaining the diversity and the functional diversity of the gut microbiome. So, I mean, in general, certain advice like that Zoe gives, like, you know, eat 30 plants a week, is in general is a pretty good idea because it's feeding lots of different phytochemicals to various different kinds of microbes. So that's maintaining that diversity. And yeah, I think the prebiotic effect is a bit more important than probiotics, for instance. You know, a lot of people pushing to consume probiotics, but I think you can get most of what you need from your diet. And that prebiotic is obviously the food that your microbes eat. So that idea of, you know, you are what you eat should be kind of shifted to you are what your microbes eat. If we can think in that way, then if you feed your microbes, then I think we'll be much better off. I'm working with someone called Felice Jacker at Deakin University. I don't know if you heard of her. She basically pioneered this field called nutritional psychiatry. So it's the idea of understanding how what you eat affects mental health. And I'm working with her on a lot of these in fact, we're working on this concept called the Grounded Minds Consortium, where we're looking at the links between soil health, food health, gut health, and then mental health. So we're really trying to draw that link from the ground through to mental health and all of those connections in between. So yeah, I think diet's super important. Thanks, Mike. Good to see you.
Thanks, Mike. Artie, did you want to? I was just going to put a little thing. I can see that Jo said that she's after something similar to the nature prescribing that they've done in the RSPB in Scotland. I'm sure you're already aware, Jo, that that's spread out to lots of other parts of the country. And Birmingham, they've got a pilot going that's been going for the last year or so, where they're the first sort of urban area. I know that they did do a couple in Scottish cities, but I think it's the biggest area probably where they're doing that. But I'm not sure whether that contains what you were after. The wildlife trusts are really into this as well, so I expect there's a load of stuff there. Forestry England is also very much into this. Then you've got NHS Forest, so there are lots of pockets where there's lots of work. And then nature prescribing through the National Association of Social Prescribers. I know that they've recently launched a network, didn't they, that people can join if they're interested in that. There's a whole, I mean, there's so many different areas for that this is now starting to blossom.
Yeah. Do you still have those? I know before I left the UK, you had like an official social prescriber do you still have PCNs over there? Is that still going?
Social prescribing is still happening, yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, so I think the UK is actually one of the leading lights in the world. It sounds weird because it is a little disjointed sometimes, so you don't always notice it. But if you move to another country, then you'll actually realise that in terms of green prescribing, the UK is doing some really good things. So, yeah, happy to put you in touch with some people as well, if that's useful.
Thanks very much. Artie, did you want to say anything before we wind up?
No, I just wanted to thank you so much once again, Jake. It's absolutely fascinating. Hopefully everyone's kind of left with something positive that they might do in their lives, and it may be a different way of looking at ourselves and our relationship with nature. So yes, thank you so much for the early start and for sharing your incredible knowledge. I also, maybe we'll have this for another talk, remember you talking about antibiotics a bit like napalming the Amazon rainforest inside us, and that stayed with me as well. So yes, thank you so much. Absolutely inspirational talk, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. Thank you very much, Jake.
Thanks, Artie. Thanks, everyone. Much appreciated.
Thanks very much indeed, Jake, and thanks for coming, everybody.